Welcome to the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm Laura DiFrancesco, your host. We're talking all about mergers and acquisitions, buying and selling small businesses, as well as corporate law. We are taking our experience closing over $10 billion of transactions since founding Dean Street Law 5 years ago, and my experience being an M&A and corporate attorney for over a decade and making it accessible to you as an entrepreneur. I hope that this helps you in navigating the complex world of mergers and acquisitions. And also, we're always happy to be a resource for you here at Dean Street Law. You can always apply to work with us through our complimentary consultations linked in our show notes. And a huge shout out and thank you to everyone who's subscribed and left us a 5-star review. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe and also leave us a 5-star review. It's one of the best ways to support us as a small business. And also be sure to share with your friends and colleagues on social media, through text, email, or however is easiest. It means the world to us that you're supporting our content and helps us make more to support you in your journey. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm your host, Laura DiFrancesco, founder of Dean Street Law, your boutique mergers and acquisitions law firm representing buyers and sellers in lower middle market transactions, as well as 5 companies total, at least 5 companies that I've founded, including Ethereal Farms, Flourish Co-working and Event Space, Laura DiFrancesco LLC, and a few others. If you are unfamiliar, I'm also the author of Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, a legal guide to buying a small business. So if you are in the process of buying a business, I'd love for you to check out the book. It has so many different resources on the process of buying a business and what you can expect, how you can think strategically to make informed decisions and make sure that you're turning terms into profit. Super important, especially when you're bringing on investors, which we're going to be talking about in this episode. When you are thinking about buying a business, your goal is to have a great return on investment and to obtain financial freedom for yourself and perhaps for generations to come in your family. And with that said, the best way to do that is to engage the right legal counsel so that you're winning on the buy and you're able to turn terms into profit. So the day one, before you even begin operating the business, you have already succeeded in making the business more profitable for your acquisition simply by having the right terms and having the right legal counsel that can support you through the process. We do that here at Dean Street Law, and we have a lot of resources to help you learn more about this, both from the book, Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, a legal guide to buying a small business, to our Acquisition Insights course on the legal aspects of buying a small business, and many other things such as our Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. So with that said, let's dig into today's episode, which is all about investor-backed acquisitions. So what is it like to do an investor-backed ETA deal? And if you're in the space of ETA or new to the space of ETA, there are a lot of different types of structures for an ETA deal. Entrepreneurship through acquisition, the process of buying a business as a path to entrepreneurship, a practice as old as commerce itself, but now being marketed to MBA students and beyond as a path to entrepreneurship in a really fantastic way. You can either do it yourself, go solo, self-fund both your search and your acquisition. Amazing if you can do it, but a lot of folks are pursuing investor-backed acquisitions, and let's chat more about what to expect with respect to that. This could come in a lot of different forms, whether you're talking about a search fund where you are fundraising for the search and the acquisition, or it could be where you're doing a self-funded search and fundraising for an acquisition. Separately, it could also be through an independent sponsor or private equity-backed deal or a number of other variations. There's so many different ways to structure an ETA deal. So we're going to be talking about working with investors in general and what it's like to do an investor-backed ETA deal. One of the important things is when you're getting investors involved, whether you're doing a search fund and getting them involved in the very beginning to whether you're getting investors involved at the acquisition stage as part of your capital stack. So how and when you get investors involved, will determine your return on investment versus their return on investment, because the earlier they're involved, the higher their risk, the higher their reward. Simple economics at play here. And so the nuances of the return on investment and specifics of the investment itself are going to be very different depending on who your investors are, their relationship to you, and how you structure that investment. It could be anything from your traditional search fund where they're looking for 35 to 40% internal rate of return on their investment, with perhaps preferred return on their equity and a buyout of a certain multiple, etc. So there's lots of structured terms there. And then it could be as simple as you have family who can stand behind you in the deal and would like to invest in the deal, and you can be more creative with the structure of that. If you're familiar with economics, you generally know that debt costs less than equity. Equity costs more than debt. So if you're able to go the more family friendly or friend creative route and fundraise and bring on investors in a debt structure, it will cost considerably less, both from a compliance perspective, because equity introduces a lot more fiduciary responsibilities and reporting requirements with the SEC and blue sky laws, to also the fact that the cost of capital is significantly less for debt than equity, because equity has generally unlimited upside returns, but there are sometimes buyouts and all that stuff that will limit the upside return. But generally, equity has considerably higher upside returns than debt that might be structured like equity, so that you have similar flexibility, especially if it's from friends and family, to more structured payment terms, as you would typically see in more like a mortgage scenario. So there's a lot of creativity that you can do with the debt side of things. When you're fundraising via debt, you don't have the same requirements for issuing security and securities compliance with the SEC and state securities laws. So it's a lot less expensive from a legal cost perspective, and can also be a lot more creative in structure as well. There's obviously tax components to both of those. So you want to be thinking through who are your investors, and that's going to generally determine what your general terms are and structure availability is. But when you're raising equity, you do want to make sure that you have investors that meet your requirements. And so those are generally considered accredited investors. They may have a certain minimum net wealth or comfort level and knowledge of financial terms as part of that. Now, when you're talking about working with an investor-backed ETA deal, what is the general difference between the relationship of the operator, yourself as the buyer, and the investors? Typically, investors are more silent investors, but you may have investors that you seek out, particularly for their knowledge and their expected participation in the advisory component of the deal post-closing. So on the friends and family side, you may be the hub of knowledge in this space, and they may be trusting in your knowledge to invest properly and make the right decisions, and they may not have as much to say about advisory and corporate governance and control rights and all of that. When you're talking about more traditional investors, there will certainly be advisory components, whether it's expected or a conversation you have about how involved they'll be post-closing, or related to the connections and help that they might be able to provide. But there certainly are generally going to be, on your more traditional investors, conversations about corporate governance, control, rights, all of that. So the relationship will be that the buyer, the operator, will generally be the day-to-day operator. And then depending on who you have as investors and how you structure it may influence whether their investors are more on the silent investor side of things, or more on the advisory side of things, or full control, and you're basically unable to make more large decisions beyond like the day-to-day operations of the business without their input. So there's a continuum of involvement that you can see from investors, but for the most part, the buyer, the operator themselves are going to be running the day-to-day of the business and expected to make decisions on behalf of and for the benefit of investors, shareholders, and keeping the business in a good operating condition and good financial condition for the benefit of debtors or equity holders. The biggest difference you'll see, of course, in the path of completely self-funded, doing this yourself versus bringing on investors is the amount of control and return on investment. So from a perspective of when you bring on investors and you ask for money, you inevitably ask for and get opinions. And that is part of bringing on investors. You are responsible for someone. You have fiduciary duties, legal duties to act in their best interest. You also have obligations to steward the company well and make good decisions. So you should learn so much about fiduciary duties. We have more about that in our book, Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, a legal guide to buying a small business. If you're interested in bringing on investors, it's a great resource for learning more about that. If not, you should be talking with your attorney before you fundraise. You absolutely need an attorney to do any sort of fundraising. There's a lot of requirements around offering securities and even debt to make sure you're complying with law. So there's going to be the oversight and reporting aspect of having investors. And then the other thing is, of course, when you are bringing on other people's money, then your piece of the pie is going to be less, whether that's from a cash flow perspective with debt or from a equity perspective in terms of bringing on equity investors. And so that can significantly impact your return on investment from the deal. So you want to be doing financial models both from a debt service coverage ratio, making sure you understand your ability to service your debt obligations post-closing, to also just understanding what is your rate of return when you factor in your purchase price and your amount of equity ownership and cash flow, and be conservative with growth projections and models and all that, so that you can make sure you're making the best decisions. When it comes to navigating corporate law, entrepreneurship, and managing small businesses, experience matters. Dean Street Law is a boutique corporate firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions and additional focus in real estate, commercial transactions, finance, and corporate governance. With over $10 billion in deals closed, Dean Street Law has extensive experience representing hundreds of clients in thousands of transactions, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Whether you need startup guidance or advice on closing multi-million or multi-billion dollar deals, we're your trusted partner every step of the way. Visit deanstreetlaw.com in the show notes to schedule a complimentary consultation. When you're talking about roles, expectations, and control, ultimately those will be documented within the corporate governance documents of your company, and that is generally going to be created in a myriad of ways. So you can have a holding company where you and the investors own the equity in the operating company, or you could have your own holding company and an investment company where you have all of the investors as well, and then your operating company. So corporate structure is something that we will talk through in great detail with our clients. We're going to talk about both the legal structure, and then we're going to work with your accountant who will do the financial forecasting. So a lot of people are like, well, why do I need an accountant if I have an attorney talking about tax? And the reason is we can tell you the law, we can tell you structure and strategy and advise you on all of those aspects. But ultimately, you need someone who's going to run the numbers to make sure that the benefit you think you're getting from a particular structure is worth the cost of that particular structure. And when you're talking about investors, this can be really, really important. So we will work with an accountant on entity structure. We'll work with you on understanding your investors and their preferences. Generally, you're going to want to have 1 to 2 lead investors, whether that's on the debt side of things or equity side of things, to understand what those terms are going to be so that you can structure the corporate structure for the investment. And just know that in some and most fundraising, it may cost more to do your fundraising than it for legal costs than it does to actually acquire the business. And this is because there are so many securities laws on the federal and state level, which is surprising. You might not expect that. But if you're expecting to pay, let's say, if you're getting an SBA loan, expect to pay probably at least $25,000 minimum in SBA fees, right? So instead of those SBA fees, if you're fundraising it through equity or debt or something like that, you are going to have those fees be made up, because instead of the SBA paying their lawyers to document all the deal, you're paying your lawyer to document the deal. And then not only that, it's not only debt, but perhaps equity as well. And so if you're fundraising, let's say $3 million, expect to be spending at least $60,000 in legal fees just for the fundraising component of it. That's not always the case. It certainly can be more simple, especially when you go the debt route. But know that if you're doing a $3 million deal, you may be spending more. If you're fundraising the entire amount through equity, you may be spending more in legal fees on the fundraising component of it than you do on the deal aspect of it, because there's so much compliance requirements. With that said, all of the roles, expectations, control, all of that will need to be documented in the transaction documents that you have with your investors. Those are generally going to be corporate governance documents. So if you have an LLC, it might be the limited liability company agreement. If you have a corporation, it's going to be the bylaws, the shareholders agreements. Sometimes you have subscription agreements. Sometimes you have side letters. Then you also have your filings with the SEC, Form D filing with the SEC. If you have a Form D exemption, you also have blue sky law filings. So you have to make a filing with the SEC when you're raising capital. And then you also have to make a filing with each state in which an investor is located for a blue sky law filing. So it is a lot more complicated than most people realize. There are few exceptions. For instance, if you're going the debt aspect and working with friends and family and able to do debt structured like equity, but actually debt, then you can have less requirements. Or for instance, if you just get an SBA loan for the whole thing, then of course you're not going to have any of the investors and not have to worry about it. But that's something to consider, is legal costs and how important it is that your documentation with your relationship with your investor properly documents the roles, expectations, and controls, the reporting requirements, the governance requirements for decision making, if there's a board, the board relationships. It's important to understand how complex this is, because a lot of people just think, well, oh, I'll have somebody else pay for this acquisition, so I'm de-risking it myself, when in fact, there's actually more risk from a litigation standpoint and legal liability standpoint when you're bringing on investors than if you're doing it yourself, because you have a fiduciary duty. You're in a position of trust where you have to act on behalf of the investors, and you have to do so in their best interest. And oftentimes your best interest and their best interest may not be fully aligned, because there is a trade-off between you and them, particularly in the ownership, control, rights to operate, all of those aspects. Now, with that said, there's a lot of obviously complications that this brings about. There's a lot of challenges, legal components that need to be addressed out with great legal counsel. What are the benefits? The benefits are sometimes it enables someone to buy a business that they may not have ever been able to buy by themselves. Maybe they didn't have the capital to do it. Maybe they didn't have the comfort with allocating that amount of capital of their own savings to an acquisition that's maybe more risky. So there's plenty of benefits. And the number one thing is financial, is giving people access to capital that may not have had the ability to buy a business on their own, or may not have been comfortable allocating that much of their own capital to buying a business on their own. It also may enable you to finance a deal that may not be traditionally financeable, especially with more risks in certain different industries, with geopolitical risk or political risk of funding and everything like that. It may be harder to underwrite a deal from a debt perspective with a traditional SBA loan. Or if you, for instance, don't have the minimum amount of capital necessary for an SBA loan and you want to fundraise, then that's a great solution. That's why there's investors. It's good for you. It's good for them. It gives you access to capital. It gives them ideally a return on investment. So it's a win-win here. But when you're thinking of that, there's a lot of different investors out there, and there's a lot of folks seeking capital. So beyond just the benefits to you, how can you make it a benefit to them? How can you position yourself as someone who's appealing to invest in? Number one thing is they're looking for someone who they have confidence in. And so if you're someone who's not doing your due diligence, not knowing what they invest in based on what's clearly and plainly on their website, like if you're just throwing darts out there to have conversations with investors and not doing your due diligence to understand who they are and how you can help them and how you're a good fit and be able to pitch yourself, then you're losing and wasting a good opportunity to speak with someone who can support you. You want to make sure that you're doing your own due diligence to be someone that they can have confidence in, not just in your relationship with them and due diligencing them, but also in having a well thought out buy box and well positioning yourself within the ETA space as someone who knows what they want and has already begun working towards going after what they want. So that's developing your buy box, developing your strategy, meeting your various advisors that you plan to work with, having conversations with sellers, doing your own work, and becoming knowledgeable about the deal making space. That includes listening to books, reading books, listening to podcasts, having conversations, being active on platforms, knowing the ETA space and ingratiating yourself within the ETA space so that you can have informed conversations and you know the acumen and you're able to position yourself as someone that they have confidence in. Because if they're going to put their dollars and name behind you, they want to make sure that they're confident that you're going to be a good representation of them. So those are a few different ways to inspire and instill confidence. And the others are understanding that they're looking to get something out of the relationship and having clear, transparent conversations about what their expectations are on terms and what they're looking for and what their investment box is and seeing if that aligns with yours and being a good participant in the marketplace. If you're not a good fit for them, but you know someone who is, I'm sure they're going to appreciate a referral. If they're someone who isn't a good fit for a particular opportunity, then make sure you keep them in mind for something else, right? Just paying it forward, being a good steward of a relationship and being someone that can add value to their life, not just ask. That's the goal when you are developing a relationship with investors. And my tip, if I can, is to develop them as early on as possible. Keep them involved and keep them in your line of communication, being able to communicate with them where you are on the process, developing a relationship over time. That will help you so that when you do need a relationship, you're able to utilize it. Certain investors will not entertain conversations prior to you being under LOI. Totally fine. Others will, though. And those are the ones that you really want to build a relationship with. And if it's someone who doesn't build a relationship prior to you being under LOI, keep in their circle, be seen, be someone who shows up. If they're going to be at a certain conference, be at that conference, shake hands, meet in person, develop relationships. That's what it's all about. So challenges and trade-offs, of course, it's going to be more pressure for performance and there's going to be more oversight in an investor relationship. You want to make sure that you're aligned not only on the investment, but also on the exit so that you have clear expectations. And when you have conversations around your vision, your alignment, there's going to be so much more success and you're going to be able to make so much more progress in your relationships when you're structuring those relationships around clear communication and trust. So if you're someone who wants to be an operator, you're looking for capital, you have experience, you feel comfortable with this level of performance and pressure for performance, then I think this is a great opportunity for you if you have the right mindset and share aligned goals. Ultimately, anybody can be a great candidate for an investor-backed ETA deal, but I think a couple of the tips that we've shared can really help you set yourself apart and honestly decide for yourself, is this something for me or not? I hope this has been helpful. The number one thing that you can do to support our podcast is leave us a 5-star review and share the podcast and Dean Street Law with folks that you know in the M&A community. We love supporting people buying and selling businesses. We work on lower middle market and Main Street transactions, and hope that we can support you in your path to entrepreneurship. If you haven't yet, check out my book, Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, a legal guide to buying a small business. You can get on the wait lists, check out the first chapter for free, pre-order it when it's available, and stay tuned for more. We hope to see you in the next episode of Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco. Cheers and happy deal making. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and that it brought you one step closer to mastering the art of mergers and acquisitions. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow and subscribe to Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you found value in our discussion, please leave a 5-star review. It would mean the world to us, and share this podcast with your network, friends, and colleagues. For more in-depth resources, be sure to visit our website, deanstreetlaw.com, where you can find articles, guides, and more information on our services. Don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest episodes, updates, tips, and exclusive content. You can find us on LinkedIn, Search Funder, at LMDFrancesco on X, and at Dean Street Law on Instagram. Join us on our next episode where we'll explore more deal-making insights. Cheers and happy deal making.